Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm just going to give a couple of minutes to allow any further attendees to join, as this is on it's not your standard Microsoft Teams call. So I think some people may have to quickly check the software. Okay, well, the number of attendees keeps ticking up a little bit, and so I'll just wait until 11:32, so full 2 minutes, but I can start to introduce things a little bit while they arrive. But so thanks everybody for coming to what would be the sixth webinar in the Energy Saving Trust's webinar series of It's Time to Decarbonize. And so today we've got Stuart, who will be helping discuss how life cycle assessment how does life cycle assessment impact your business and decarbonization plans? So my name is Nathan. I work with Stuart, but he will be giving the main presentation. And just as a bit of general housekeeping, this webinar will be recorded, and so you can access the webinar afterwards. We do potentially have some issues with the internet, as is a standard for any sort of call, but hopefully those will be kept low, and if there are any, we'll try and solve them as they come. Yeah. So we encourage anybody, though, to ask questions in the webinar using the chat box. The chat box might be visible to you in a drop-down menu system on the go-to webinar set of tabs on the right, on which side you have chosen to place it. And we will also be posting a poll of 5 questions after the webinar as well. And so you should be able to see these come up on your screen in order to answer those polls. And this will be anonymous, but this is just for us to get some general feedback on the presentation as well itself and how to improve things. Afterwards, we'll be going through those questions in the Q&A period of time. We've been given a few questions ahead of the presentation, and so we'll start with those, but we'll then move on to any of the other questions in the chat, and I'll try and filter them by genre just to try and make sure we get the ones that are most pertinent to people. However, if you do have any questions that are more specific to your organization or might be a bit more in depth, there should be a form in the chat. Yes, I think it's in the chat just now. It's the one that's highlighted, at least for me, it's highlighted in green. But at the bottom of that, you can see a link, and this is follow this link to then set up a personalized session, and we can then just go through any of your more detailed questions at a different time. But with that, I'd like to say thanks, and just next slide to Nora, and we'll be able to give a bit of a background on Energy Saving Trust. But I think we don't quite have the other slides. So yeah, I think at Energy Trust, we just aim to address the climate emergency and deliver wide benefit of clean energy as we transition to net zero. So what we tend to do is we empower households to make better choices, deliver transformative programs for governments, and support businesses with strategy, research, and assurance, enabling everyone to play their part in building a sustainable future. And so with that, I will hand us over to Stuart, who has the slides already set to go. And I'll mute myself and let Stuart take over. Thanks again, Stuart.
Great, thank you, Nathan. We're about to find out if I had that slide that I was supposed to show or not, so apologies if I do have. Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to talk about life cycle assessment and the lovely long title of how does life cycle assessment impact your business decarbonisation plans. So basically, I'm going to give a kind of an introduction of life cycle assessment, talk a little bit about kind of what it is, how we do it, how you might do it, how it can kind of interact with your decarbonisation plans, how it can aid your decarbonisation plans, and the other kind of benefits of it, and talk a little bit about kind of what it involves to actually undertake a life cycle assessment, or an LCA as we'll call it as we go through. So okay, so yeah, so a bit of a kind of content overview. So yeah, just talk, as I said, about kind of what is it, give a bit of an introduction. I know some people on the call that have a little bit of experience, but I think a lot of people answered the poll to say that they were relatively new to LCA, which is great. So I'm happy to kind of provide an introduction and a bit of background. Talk a bit about how it differs from emissions measurement, and where the two kind of align, where the two kind of how it works, what we do, yeah, that link with your decarbonisation planning, and then a bit about kind of interpreting LCA if somebody else has done some work for you. And if it's time at the end, I do have a little section about kind of good and bad LCA. And I don't know whether we will have time for that or not. I can always cover that in questions if people need to. Okay, so without further ado, so what is LCA? So LCA is a modeling tool, and so it's similar to other kind of modeling tools. It's a representation of reality rather than an actual measurement of reality. So it's showing us a version of what's going on, but it basically is a method that allows us to understand the full impact, and we'll come back to that word impact in a minute, of a product or process. So it's commonly done with a product. So if you're a company that manufactures a thing, or a number of things, that's where it's kind of the most common and perhaps the easiest to kind of understand, but it's applicable to processes and can even be applied to organizations and other items. But yeah, it does that basically by considering the sub-processes and the sub-products that are required to either make a product or enable a product or something like that. So basically all the ingredients that go into making your thing, and all the processes that are required to turn those ingredients into your thing, all be summarized and all be calculated, and the emissions and the impact of those all kind of summarized, and that gives us the overall impact of our product in very simple terms. So what can it be used for? So it can be used in, it's a very useful kind of design tool, an optimization tool. So it allows us to find impact, and again I'll come back to impact in a minute. Impact kind of hotspots within a product or process, so within the way we make something or the way we use something or dispose of something or anything. It can show us the areas that we can focus our efforts to make, and to, as I've said there, to optimize for a low impact product. So it really shows us the areas we should be really driving our efforts to reduce impact. And it also allows us to undertake comparisons. So it allows us to look at how a product compares to alternatives or compares to different methods of doing things, previous methods of doing things, potential future methods of doing things, future products. It allows us to sort of see what changes in impact we might be able to drive in future, or that we've already had compared to the past. So to just go a little bit more about that word impact that I mentioned. So we're probably all familiar with the idea of kind of a carbon footprint. So that's we might describe that as the amount of carbon emissions in a product, for example. So we've got a couple of examples on the right there. I think we've got washing powder and oat milk, which shows kind of each displaying their carbon footprint on the product, which is a great step forward, if you forgive the pun. There's a few slight differences there. So you can see the top one, the washing powder, is showing CO2, whereas the bottom one, if you can see in detail, is showing kilograms of CO2e per kilogram. These are basically different metrics for how you report the emissions. But the important thing to see is the top one is just CO2, so that is reporting carbon dioxide emissions, so that's carbon footprint. The bottom one has the little e at the end, which shows its equivalent, so that's reporting not just carbon, that's reporting all greenhouse gases. So they're going to be fairly similar, the numbers, but it's an important kind of difference. There's a lot of other greenhouse gases than just CO2, so those differences are important, but potentially not in what we're talking about today. So LCA can be used to calculate these kind of impacts of this carbon footprint, but LCA allows us to calculate a load more stuff than that, which is why we talk about impact rather than just emissions, because it allows us to look at, so that product will have a certain carbon footprint, but it also has a land use footprint. So all the land that's required to grow the things that are then processed to make the stuff, which is then goes into making the product and is then milled down and then becomes a product. That land use back upstream can be accounted for through LCA. Similarly, water use. So, for example, a product that has soy milk or something that requires a lot of stuff to be grown, that has a large water footprint, for example, because it requires some water for irrigation and such like. Similarly, kind of health impacts. So if we make something and somewhere along the manufacturing process we're releasing huge amounts of smog or particulate matter and things like that, we're going to have an impact on health. Similarly, environmental impact, emissions and toxicity, if we're releasing things into watercourses and so on. We can go on for a long time. There's a lot of various kind of impact categories. We can also look at some even non-environmental impacts, so those kind of socio-economic things. So we can look at life cycle costing even, or we can look at social impacts, so social LCA. We can look at the impact on job creation and so on. So I appreciate that in terms of what we're talking about today, we're probably focusing on carbon footprint, but it's just really important and worth to highlight that LCA can give us this much more holistic kind of view of our product and of the impact of it. And it's worth kind of just, as an aside, just kind of highlighting that we need to we do need to bear in mind those overall impacts and not just consider carbon footprint. Sorry, I just opened the questions. I don't know how to get. There we go. Okay. So moving on to when to use LCA. So I think in terms of what we're talking about today and the kind of description that we gave for this webinar, the most likely impacts, or the most likely places to use LCA are going to be in understanding the impact of a product. So if you manufacture a product, looking at the impact of the manufacture, the use, the disposal of everything I said. So that's the impact of that product, particularly if the making the product is sort of the main thing that you do. So if you're a manufacturing business and you make a product or a series of range of products, the impact of those is likely to be a big part of your overall impact. If you're making a product is only a small part of what you do and something else is a much more impactful thing, then that's likely that it will be only a smaller impact, so it may not be so important for you. But if you're a manufacturer of a product, then this is going to be an important way to more accurately calculate the impact or the emissions of your product. The second option is if you, and there's no reason you couldn't be in both cases, is if you manufacture a product that has low emissions or contributes to emissions reduction. So you then can work out the impact of your product in comparison to an alternative, or in comparison to a competitor perhaps, or in comparison to a way that something was done previously. So a good example here might be something like an electric vehicle. If you manufacture an electric vehicle, you want to be able to prove that your product is better than an internal combustion engine vehicle. So you want to undertake an LCA of both products, compare them side by side and say, look, we're better over the full life cycle. And that one sentence that I just said there is years of work and huge amounts of work, but that's the kind of comparison that might be able to do. So that's when I think LCA is most useful, probably to people who are here today. Okay, so to answer a couple of quick kind of questions. So is LCA different from emissions measurement? I'm sure you've understood from this point already. Yes, it is. So in emissions measurement, we're looking at the whole total emissions of an organization. So we're looking at the emissions from everything that you do, from your scope 1 and scope 2, your gas purchases, fuel purchases for vehicles, electricity purchases, your scope 3, everything you buy, everything else that's included in all the scope 3 categories that you choose to report. So that's your overall organizational footprint. The manufacture of products that you make is or should be included in that. So the raw materials that you take in would be included in your purchased goods and services, and the products you make would obviously be included in the sold products categories, but not in the level of detail that they would be if we undertook a proper LCA. So in LCA we consider products. I've said one product at a time. That's essentially true. We can also look at kind of product families and product categories, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. But yeah, we can. So essentially, we look at one product at a time, and we look at it over the whole, over its whole life cycle, and we look at the benefits as well as the impacts of it. And so that can then feed into the whole organizational emissions calculation, but is only a proportion of it. I've said a small proportion. It might numerically be a large proportion, but in terms of the calculation overall, it's just a part of it. So yeah, as I said, the LCA and emissions measurement are complementary but different. So this is where LCA can really feed into your kind of decarbonisation strategy and your emissions measurement and reporting methods. This is where you can really kind of get benefit from undertaking LCA. Okay, so can you do your own LCA? Yes, you can. So I'll show in a minute about kind of how it quickly becomes relatively complex, but it can certainly be done. It's not something that a busy person who's already got loads of things to do is just going to be able to do in a few minutes alongside their current role. It's going to need you're going to need somebody to either undertake some training or to bring in somebody with some experience and some who has undertaken some training, but it's certainly not impossible. You are very likely to need to purchase some software. So you may, in theory, you can kind of capture all your data yourself from your product manufacturing. So you can measure the energy use of your equipment that's running. You can look at all the stuff that you buy. You can weigh everything. You can go to all your suppliers and gather as much information as you can about the products that they buy in. But I think it would be unrealistic to do a proper detailed LCA without the use of some software, and that software is going to give you access to a database, which is going to give you be able to give you impacts of raw materials or of manufacturing processes or things like that, and allow you to calculate those. And the software will also allow you to do that amalgamation where you work out what proportion of each part is required and so on. But yeah, with the software, which is to give you an idea for a single kind of user using a standard piece of software and some databases of the order of kind of £4,000 or £5,000 probably for the kind of at the basic level. Yeah, so as I've said, if the product is very simple, I mean, you can also undertake a kind of back of the envelope type LCA, but then I think you would then be at the point where you'd be putting in effort and actually not getting anything that you wouldn't get from your standard emissions calculation anyway. I think to do it well and to get something useful from it, you'll need to do it properly and need to go to that next level. But happy to answer any questions on that or to have further discussions if anybody would like to. So I think the next thing that I've got here is just to kind of give a quick example. So I don't know if my explanation of kind of how it works and what it all means and things has made sense or not, but whether it has or hasn't, here's an example about a sandwich. So we're coming up to lunchtime. So we've got a sandwich here. So I know it's quite clearly a ham sandwich, but for some reason when I labeled it, I labeled it as if it was a cheese sandwich. So we've got what we would call the ingredients of the sandwich there. So you can see that those are the things that we're going to put into the sandwich. So to make the sandwich, we need those things. But to make the sandwich, we probably also need some other things. So say we serve it on a plate. We're going to use a chopping board or something to prepare the sandwich, and we're going to use a knife to move some of those products around to put them into the sandwich. So those are the kind of ingredients that we'd say we need. But the plate and the board and the knife aren't really ingredients. So they're actually made up of these things. So they're made up of these products. The knife is probably made of steel, the board's probably plastic, and the plate's probably ceramic. So, but we're also going to use, we're not going to use a whole, we're not going to take a chopping board, make one sandwich on it, and that isn't the end of its life. So we're going to use a proportion of the life cycle of a chopping board, which we'll come to in a minute. But also all these products all have their own ingredients. So these aren't raw materials, any of these. So they have their own next level of ingredients and also processes required to get them from those ingredients to those products in red that we're going to use. So for example, the bread, that's made of flour and yeast and various other things, but it also requires processes. So the flour requires a milling process. The yeast and the flour together need a baking process. The baking process requires electricity, and so on. So you can see as we go around here, you can see all the various kind of inputs that are required. So you can see that even for a relatively simple example, this quickly gets quite complicated, and we could easily go to the next level there. So obviously the yeast in a packet that you would buy to use in the kitchen isn't a raw material. So that has some upstream processes as well. That has the packaging, it has the processing that's required to undertake the yeast, the heat that's required to dry the yeast to prepare it, and so on. So you can see that quickly these things get quite complicated, and that's where using that software and those databases are useful. Yeah, so we maybe didn't anticipate necessarily that you would need to know the impact of a blast furnace in order to undertake an LCA of a sandwich, but to do it fully, that level of detail would actually be included. Okay, so just to kind of close out that example, so yeah, this is the kind of overall sort of impact you would get down to a third level, and using that LCA software, it goes further and further back and goes all the way back to raw materials. But what we would ultimately get at the end of that process is this. So we would have the impact per sandwich, would probably be what would be called the functional unit. We can define various functional units, and they need to be quite carefully defined to allow us to compare similar products. So again, in a vehicle comparison, if one vehicle lasts 100,000 miles and one vehicle lasts 200,000 miles, we need to be comparing like with like. So we need to compare them over a standardized lifetime. So which is another important kind of nuance of making sure that you're undertaking LCA correctly. But yeah, in this example, so the impact per sandwich we would end up with, so we would have some impact in whatever impact categories we chose to measure. So greenhouse gas, and I've just listed a few other options there that we might look at. We would, if we were doing it to an ISO standard or an EU standard, we would have a certain list of impact categories that we were required to use. If we were just doing it for our own interest, greenhouse gas, land and water is always a popular kind of starting point, but really we should be choosing our impact categories based on where the likely greatest impact is. So we should be looking at where we're likely to be having the greatest impact. Okay, so coming back out of the example, a quick kind of talk about scope of LCA. So I've not called this scope here because that's obviously, it does kind of potentially cause some confusion with the scopes of the greenhouse gas protocols, so the scope 1, 2, and 3, which is entirely different to what this is talking about here. So I've called this stages in this case, but in literature and on LCA training and things, you may see this called scopes as well. So you can see across the top, we've got some kind of very broad kind of sections of a product lifetime. And these are designed to include any product. So we can say materials, pre-processing, manufacturing, distribution, use, and end-of-life treatment. So those are kind of generic categories that probably would apply to any product in some way. If we undertake what's called a cradle-to-gate assessment, so we start with the raw materials, and we go through the processing and the manufacture of the thing, and we go to the distribution of that thing, or we go to some level of distribution. So we're saying basically that we're looking at the product until it leaves our factory gate, is where the gate term comes from. So we're talking about we're making the thing and then we're releasing it to the world, and that's where we're stopping our assessment. If we do what's called a cradle to grave assessment, so we go to that point, and then we also include the use of the product, so whatever it does over its lifetime, and then we include the end of life treatment. So we look at how it's likely to be disposed of, or what's going to happen to it, if it can be recycled, reused, and so on, and how that's treated at the end of life. And then we could also consider a cradle to cradle assessment. So this is kind of looking at a circular economy type product. This is if we're saying that the product has some element that can be reused or can be kind of remanufactured and go back to either the raw materials, or that the arrow that goes back in may re-enter slightly further right. So it might enter with the pre-processing or with some additional level of impact to make that into a product that can be remade. So the reason I'm showing this, and the important kind of thing with this, is when you're looking at LCA, either if you're looking to do LCA or looking to compare LCA results, it's really important to make sure that you're doing so over the same stages here. So comparing a cradle to gate result with a cradle to grave result is essentially pointless, because you're comparing entirely different things. You've got different things included in those assessments. So it's important to make sure that the studies you're comparing, if you're engaging somebody to undertake LCA for you, or if you're looking at somebody else's LCA, it's important to understand what stages are included, to what level they're included, and make sure that you're comparing like with like. It is often possible, if you're looking at, for example, a cradle to grave assessment, to reduce that down to a cradle to gate assessment, if it's published in such a way that allows you to do that. But sometimes you see amalgamated results across a whole assessment. That means you wouldn't be able to break those categories down, so you wouldn't be able to compare that to a cradle to gate. But yeah, that's an important consideration. Okay, so kind of starting to bring this section to a close. So I've just got a few kind of pros and cons really of LCA, so things that you might want to sort of bear in mind before we get into the questions. So quickly, kind of the positives. So as we said, really it allows much more detailed assessment of the impact of a product in a way that no other method really does. So it allows you to really see see what goes into your product, what the impact of it is, and how that's spread across the product, even down to the level of suppliers, for example, if you've done it well. By doing that, it allows you to highlight hotspots, allows you to see any potential kind of unforeseen consequences. So if you change from one source of a certain product, or from one product to another, one type of polymer, for example, to a different one, you may not think that there was going to be a huge impact overall in your product, but I don't know, if one has a significantly high melting point or something like that, and suddenly requires a sudden uplift in the amount of energy you're using, something like that, you might sort of see a potential real jump in your emissions. Or similarly, if you're going the other way, you may find that there's a real change you could make that would suddenly kind of release a load of extra, remove a load of emissions from your product. So it can be used in a really kind of clever way to kind of look at in depth in those results and see how you can use those. It can also be used to support environmental claims. In fact, it should be used to support environmental claims. So claims that are made, for example, to go back to the vehicles example, should obviously always be supported by scientific LCA claims and comparison, as we said, along the same scope, and ideally both using the same standards. So to move over to standards, which I've got mentioned on the right, so just to kind of as we move across, I just mentioned this. So there's a series of ISO standards, so ISO 14040 as a kind of framework, and 14044 as specific kind of requirements. So a great way to make sure that your LCA can be compared to others, and that that you are doing a good LCA that can be that will allow you to make some real insights into it, is to adhere to those 14,000 series ISO standards. There's also an EU standard called the Product Environmental Footprint, the PEF, which is is another similar useful standard that is a bit more descriptive in what it tells you to do. So that's quite a useful standard, and also gives you a list of recommended impact categories, as we discussed before. So includes things like that, eutrophication and greenhouse gas impact and so on. And in order to make a claim, you need to adhere to a certain set of standards in there. So I said that there's no current universal standards. So that's because there are a range of standards, and some people use different standards, and standards are adhered to in a lot of cases, but not always. And there's not always a kind of insistence that standards are adhered to. So there is a proliferation of kind of questionable LCA, and it's important to kind of make sure that you ask those questions that we said about scope and the stages, and about the ISO standards, and whether the relevant impact categories have been included, and so on, just to make sure that, as I said, you're comparing apples with apples. And the final con, which is the one that I put at the top, is just about kind of, so as I said, it is achievable in-house. It's a fascinating subject, so I'm sure that if anybody is looking at doing it in-house, you'll have a wonderful time learning about it. Whether it's achievable to do a full kind of detailed LCA of a complex product in-house, I would question, but if the time is available and the resources available, there's no reason why not, really. Otherwise, there are many good consultancies out there who would be happy to kind of discuss with you. Range of LCA options available. So I think for now that brings me to the end of the slides. So I think we have some questions, and I'm hoping that Nathan might reappear to help me out at this point with some questions.
Yeah. Hi again. Yes. Perfect timing. So. Thank you for sending in a couple of questions in the chat. There is still time to answer some further questions, but sorry, Stuart, before we jump on the questions, I think that there might be a poll.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
First of all, there's a small plug, first of all.
Yeah, it's okay. But,
so this is our, after you, Nathan, you go for it.
Okay, cool. No worries. There is another webinar, as Stuart has just mentioned. So this is, I think, our 6th webinar just now. So there is a 7th and an ongoing series of these. And the next webinar would be on how can you sell more of your green products and services and enable your customers to save energy, money, and the planet. And this one will be on the 5th of December at 11 a.m. So as if this doesn't necessarily immediately apply to you, I'd suggest you have a think about your colleagues and whether or not they are interested in something that could be that that this could be useful for. And I believe that Nora may share a poll just now. Here we are. Okay, cool. I don't know if anybody can hear me anymore, but if you can, there are 5 questions of these, so please give you a bit of time to fill this in, and then we'll move along to fill in some of the questions or answer some of the questions. All right, I think that is all 5 of the polls. So I think we'll move on to some of the questions. Thank you everybody for answering those. And Stuart, I'm going to start you off with hopefully a quick one. I think you may have answered it in the talk, but we'll give it again. Is it feasible to carry out LCA in-house across diverse products and supply chains without investing in specialist software?
Probably not. Yeah, I mean, in theory it is, yes, because you said in-house. So yeah, if you had an in-house team or a person who was very dedicated to it, and you had a relatively long period of time to do it, then there's no reason you couldn't do it. I mean, the LCA software itself is essentially big, powerful spreadsheet software, so it can be done. You can, yeah, I think the challenge will be there's a fair kind of learning curve, so you would need somebody with a reasonable amount of time to dedicate to it, but it's certainly not impossible. The second barrier you would have would be the access to database data. So you could solve that either by, like I said in the poll, by kind of measuring everything and collecting data for everything, which is feasible but kind of challenging. There are the sources of data. If it's really kind of valuable to you not to have to purchase that software, then you can look in kind of academic literature and various other kind of publications, and you can find some of that information there. There are also some free LCA databases. They're kind of quite limited, but they will give you some information. So you can do it. And yeah, I mean, it would give you an excellent kind of understanding of what's going on if you were to start doing it. But yeah, I think as the question talked about, kind of a large number of products, didn't it, and diverse things and stuff like that.
That's another question. That's a different one.
Okay. I think if the question had said, is it possible to do an LCA in-house for one simple product if I have lots of time available, then maybe I would have said yes. But I think for when we're getting to complicated products, it's getting slightly harder.
All right, so one of the other questions that was sent in beforehand, so this is just a very quick apology to those that have sent in questions during the talk. We will get to those, but I feel like I should get to the ones that were sent in beforehand first. But so, what are some of the best tools for life cycle assessment?
Yeah, okay, so I'll try and be quick so we get all the questions. So some of the best tools if you are purchasing are this most common software is probably one called SIMAPRO, so that's SIMAPRO. So that comes with a database called EcoInvent, which is the kind of very commonly used, fairly standard kind of database. Certainly others are available. I'm not necessarily making recommendations, but that's certainly the most commonly used package. So that one, you buy the software and it comes with the database. There's an open source version called OpenLCA, where the software is free, but you would then have to buy the database. You could buy EcoInvent or any other similar database. There's a second kind of system called Gabi, G-A-B-I, which uses a different database, which is also very good, and that's kind of a slightly more kind of visual software, works in a slightly different way, but should give you not the same answer, but should give you very similar answers. Those three are probably the most common. There's also loads of various other options. There's loads of people trying to sell you kind of claims that they can do the LCA magically with one click and such like, which maybe are slightly quicker, but maybe give you a slightly less precise answer.
Cool. And I think another follow-on question, then this is one that was earlier. Our products are used in lots of industries, and so for a variety of different applications. But so their question is, how would they go about trying to do LCA and without having to do this 100 times approximately?
Yeah. So I think the way I would approach it is look at to what point your products are the same, and then at what point do they diverge. So then you can probably do from what you said, it would appear that when we consider that chart where we looked at the cradle to gate and so on, I would imagine that your products are probably sounded like they were kind of similar up to the cradle to gate section, and then the use phase would be different, and then possibly the end of life as well. So I'd kind of do the central bit as one LCA, and then try to kind of run a series of options for the use phase, and then again for the end of life if you need to, and then you can combine the results. So you may have to do part of it 100 times, but you shouldn't have to do all of it 100 times. Another option, sorry, very quickly, would be to quantify some kind of best and worst, and rather than doing the 100, just do the 0 and the 100, and then you will know that your products or your other products lie somewhere in that range.
Right, I think that was quite good. So I'm going to just jump to one of the more semi-related questions, because we've just been talking about products, but one person in the chat, I believe, related to healthcare, wanted to ask, could it be provided similar? So rather than just answering it only for healthcare, I believe it's sort of a service. Can you apply LCA to a service as a product instead of just?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So you certainly can. Yep. So you can apply. Yeah. So whereas the equivalent of all the ingredients and things that went in to make the sandwich would be all the things that you have to do to undertake the service. So any travel that's required, training that's required, equipment that might be required there. So it might be that the products are required as inputs, but the output is a service. But yeah, absolutely, you can do LCA for service. Yeah.
Okay. And I think we do have a couple of questions that are from the same user, who is talking about asking about councils, and so this can be a bit of a rabbit hole. So I would just want to suggest everyone know that there is in the chat, you can fill in a fill in a form in order to just actually set up a meeting with us that will go into a bit more detail on any questions that are perhaps a little bit too long to answer in this format. But so I'm just going to go to the question in the chat, which is anyone at EST considering engaging with local authority planning departments to suggest how LCA can be incorporated into planning approval decisions?
I'm not sure whether we certainly are in touch with a lot of local authority planning departments, and obviously doing lots of kind of other work with people. So we could certainly engage on that. I think so. I think we would have to work out where LCA would be most useful in those cases, and I have an inkling that might be kind of somebody talking about sort of embodied carbon and things like that perhaps in building materials, which is a really important area, and it certainly is something that we are looking at. So yeah, I think. I think that is something that is certainly coming to that kind of planning sector. There's been a lot of talk about it and how we can compare kind of embodied carbon in existing structures that we may knock down or dismantle, and whether that replacing them with newer structures is valuable when there's still life in the existing ones. yeah, it's all kind of linked into the sort of retrofit and live energy use, kind of, yeah, ongoing current energy use versus embodied energy and embodied carbon. Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's certainly one that we are looking at. I think whether we're discussing that with the local authorities or not at the moment, I'm not sure. But yeah, we're certainly aware of the kind of importance of embodied carbon, and it's an area where LCA is about the only thing that can give you the right answer.
Yeah. So I just want to remind people again, if the questions could, that one could go on further and further. So if you do want further detail to any of these other questions or have other ideas, you can fill in this form in the chat again, to get something in a bit more detail. And I have one more question, I believe, which I think is quite rather interesting. They'd love to hear how you would approach calculations needed from a tier 2 plus, and should they go to that level of detail. So rather than just answer that question immediately, I think if you could pull backwards a little bit and just explain these different tiers that are in LCA.
Yeah, so I think that's talking about kind of tiers of suppliers. So when we talk about yeah, so tier 1 being a supplier to our business, tier 2 being a supplier to that tier 1 business, tier 3 being a supplier to them, and so on. So so I mean, LCA doesn't, you wouldn't often specify the tier that you were going to. You would essentially need to go all the way back to the raw material. So that might be, I mean, if you're buying something like aggregate for a road or something like that, your tier 1 supplier might start with the raw material and give you that. If you're buying something that has multiple manufacturing phases and stages and goes through multiple companies, you might be in kind of 4 or 5 tiers before you get back to that raw material. So LCA looks at kind of doesn't look at necessarily at the company providing the thing level. It more looks at the product level. So it looks at, yeah, going all the way back up to raw materials. If we're talking about collecting data directly from companies rather than using LCA databases, which in theory is the ideal, then that's when the involvement of multiple tiers does obviously make things really complicated, because as a manufacturer, we are a long way from our kind of tier 4 or 5 supplier, and in some cases we probably don't even know who they are. So engaging with them and trying to get data from them and information from them is a big kind of challenge, and it's at that level when using the databases is kind of the only feasible option. But yeah, sorry, I kind of lost the question a bit. Does that help with the question? Sorry.
I think so. It's difficult to get a full response from people, but if you I can read the chat in real time. So if people did want to actually give further follow on, I can do that. But I believe that has answered some of the questions for now, unless anybody wants to make one that could be answered in 2 minutes. Then we may have to end the presentation and say thanks again for everybody coming. So I'd like to remind people again that you can absolutely continue the conversation just by selecting the link that is in the chat, and that is in the chat. And I'd like to remind people again about the other presentation that is coming up on December the 5th. And just there will be, I believe, a few more of these. So this is an ongoing series. But so once again, thank you, Stuart, for giving this talk, and thank you everybody for coming here, and thank you, Nora, who's been in the background facilitating all of this and helping actually make all of this happen. So once again, thank you everybody, and I hope you have a nice day.
Thank you everybody. Thanks Nathan. Thanks Nora. Thanks everybody.